Hello, everyone. I'm Marcia Kavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, if there is anything common about Common Core, it is certainly not the consensus of its worthiness. This week, we saw the governor and the state education superintendent go in opposite directions. More united was the Republican congressional delegation, which yesterday elected Steve Scalise as its party whip. We'll be talking about education and politics tonight, including the plight of UNO, the state's past political strength in Congress, and the demand for engineers. We'll also look back at former Pontchartrain Beach amusement park, which opened 75 years ago this week. And taking the ride with us are tonight's Informed Sources, Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources, Richard Thompson, columnist, the New Orleans Advocate, and Kathy Finn, freelance business journalist and columnist for the New Orleans Magazine, Stephanie Grace, columnist, the New Orleans Advocate. And there's Stephanie. There you go. And we're going to go right to you first off, Stephanie, because Steve Scalise is beaming these days. He's number 3 in GOP leadership.
He really contain himself, and you can't really blame him. This is a big deal. Steve Scalise, who's only been in Congress really since 2008, was elected Thursday to the number 3 spot in the House leadership, the GOP leadership. He's the highest-ranking member of Congress from Louisiana, really since Hale Boggs. So big deal.
That goes back a long way. That's 1972.
And the highest ranking that the Republicans have ever had. So what it means is, so he's the number 3 person. This, of course, was precipitated by Eric Cantor's very surprising loss in Virginia. He was the majority leader. So what happened is there was a very quick election to replace him, and the person who replaced him is a guy named Kevin McCarthy from California, who was the whip. So Scalise had a chance to move up, and it was a contested race. It was a 3-way race. He was up against a congressman from Illinois, another from Indiana. He was up against the deputy whip, so the person who really should have been next in line if it had gone by seniority. But Scalise, I think this really points to Scalise's strengths in Congress. He was head of something called the Republican Study Committee, which is the caucus of House conservatives. Now, if you watch the House, you know there are a lot of conservatives, 176 members, so that's a big base to start with. And one of the things he really played was he's the only person in the leadership now from a red state. He's the only one from the South. He's the only one from a big energy state. So I think the feeling was that, when you look at who makes up the Republican delegation in Congress, John Boehner speakers from Ohio, Kevin McCarthy's from California, there should be some red staters in there. But the big thing is he's good at this. This is, he was in the legislature for a long time in Louisiana. He was successful there. He had a conference call earlier with reporters, and I asked him about his relationship with Boehner, which, who's more moderate than he is. And he said, we don't go out drinking. We have a very professional relationship. But one of the things he did in the Republican Study Committee is he said he would, instead of waiting for the leadership to hand bills down and then they would see if the conservatives would like them, he was more proactive. He went and said, this is what we'd like. And then he would go back to the conservatives and say, okay, if we get this, you have to vote for it. So he really is good at, I think, smoothing out some of the differences you see in
Why don't you explain quickly, too, what the whip
does? What a whip is. Yeah. It's taken from the fact that you whip people into place. He's a vote counter, really. So it's not so much an issue-oriented position. It's very procedural, but it's powerful. It means that you're able to put together coalitions.
And he supposedly is really very good at doing that.
He really is. And again, I think we saw that in Baton Rouge, and we're seeing that in
But to do that job,
Congress.
You have to come from a safe district for your party.
You do.
If your district is divided, you can't be the guy that's rallying people behind your party stance. And he comes from the right type of district to be a whip.
He can have that seat as long as he wants. That's a very conservative district. He's very conservative. He waited a while to get there. He's staying, I think.
Honestly, he's really showing some success there. And it was sort of anticipated perhaps it would take more than one vote, but he did it just in one vote. He
There's a runoff situation. Maybe he learned how to do that in Louisiana, but he did. He campaigned hard. He had 50 whips, even for his campaign to become whip. He had 50 whips. He took them all out to a Cajun restaurant in Washington, D.C. They had boudin balls and oysters.
It's Louisiana training, and he really knows how to treat people.
He does.
What is this going to mean for the state of Louisiana?
Well, that's to be seen. Again, the last probably really powerful Republican in the House we had was Bob Livingston, who was Appropriations Committee chair. So you know what that means. That means that money goes from Washington to the district. It's less clear. There's less money, for one thing, and the Republicans don't like to spend money the way they used to. But it's, anytime you're in the room and at the table, it's good. And he's been really good on flood control, on flood insurance. Yeah. He's certainly focused on those issues
and
as
so
much
how
as
safe
anyone.
is he in the seat, beyond, do you think, midterms?
In the whip
November,
seat?
yeah, in the whip seat.
I can't. It's hard
He's
to
safe.
imagine them making a change so quickly.
Yeah.
I don't think much is going to happen between now and November in Congress anyway, because there are elections this year.
Right, right. So you mentioned Bob Livingston, and that seat for the 1st Congressional District has an interesting history, Errol.
Yeah, the district of course the boundaries change with redistricting from time to time, but it has roughly been the northern part of New Orleans, and at different times it has taken on various parts of surrounding parishes. But I guess the northern part, the lakefront of New Orleans, has always been the common denominator. But because it's a conservative district, the people that have held the seat, for the most part, have been able to really not have to worry about politics and could develop themselves. For the longest time, like from 41 to 77, F. Edward Hebert held that seat. And that was at the time when everybody was a Democrat, but he was a conservative Democrat. And he became chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. It was able to do a lot to deliver military appropriations to New Orleans. And so he was very popular, again, representing that district. He was replaced by a guy named Rick Tonry, who was sort of a hapless, he got into an election vote fraud thing, and so he didn't last. But he defeated Bob Livingston. But when Tonry wound up in jail, there was another election, and Bob Livingston was elected to that seat, and Livingston became very powerful. You know, it's hard to say who was closer to power, Hale Boggs or Bob Livingston, because Hale Boggs, who represented New Orleans' other district, the 2nd Congressional District, when his plane disappeared in Alaska, was the House Majority Leader, and so he was viewed as being in line to be the Speaker of the House. When Bob Livingston had to resign, or chose to resign in 1998 because of the sex scandal, Livingston had been selected to be Speaker of the House. I mean, he was Speaker of the House designated, and so that was probably maybe a notch before Hale Boggs. And so twice in our history we've had men who were just about that close to becoming Speaker of the House, and one was a tragic death, and the other was a political scandal. And so we never had a Speaker, but at least we have a whip. After Livingston, when he resigned from Congress, that seat was taken over by David Vitter. And Vitter went and used that as a launching pad to be elected to the United States Senate. And had he not gotten into his own problems, I think Vitter could be really one of the really major, powerful players in the Senate. I mean, there was even talk about it, vice presidential rumors for David Vitter one time. And then once Vitter got elected to the Senate, he was replaced by Bobby Jindal. And of course, Jindal was able to use that as a stepping pad to be governor. And then once Jindal was elected, we have Steve Scalise, who's been able to parlay.
And Scalise so, kind of ended up stepping aside both of those times. He was working that seat all this time.
And the one thing that there's been, despite the fact that anybody that's held that seat, except for Tonry, has been very, very secure in that seat because of their political ambitions and things they've moved on. But so there's been a fair amount of turnover in that seat. But Scalise is probably the guy that's going to be there for a long time.
So. And it's something else to remember about that seat is it's next to the 2nd District, which is a voting rights district, which means the African Americans, the Democrats, people who are now Democrats, now that we have two parties, are all in the 2nd District. So this is, it's East Jefferson and St. Tammany. It is as conservative a district as we have in Louisiana, and one of the most conservative in the country.
And parts of Orleans too, right?
A little like Lakeview and a little bit of uptown Orleans.
The 2nd was designed, frankly, to have a black majority.
Exactly.
And with the intent of being able to elect a black legislator.
So there's the spillover effect as it makes the district around it
But once
very
you do that,
conservative.
it changes the demographics of another district.
And so Cantor is going to be stepping down, Eric Cantor, as majority leader the end of July.
The end of July, so that's when Steve Scalise will become whip. And then, of course, they go into recess, and it's an election year, so they're not going to be doing much at all. And especially, Cantor's loss has created some disarray in terms of what they might do anyway, what they might have done anyway.
All right, great. Thanks, Stephanie. And Errol, I'm going to move on over to Richard now. And unfortunately, University of New Orleans is having some hard times these days. And it's hard for me as a UNO alum to see it, and I know Errol as well. Tell us what's going on over there.
Well, just last week, UNO President Peter Foss announced that the university was going to start to undergo a restructuring in which they're going to form a committee of about 25 deans and faculty leaders. We're going to try to devise a criteria to really look at the school's 84-degree programs and kind of see what can be cut in order to save money and where they have their strengths that they can start to reinvest some of their money in.
Now, UNO moved from the LSU system over to the University of Louisiana system. Has this not been beneficial? What's causing the problems for UNO?
Well, it's been a tough couple of years for UNO, really. In the last 5 years, they've seen their state funding drop by almost half. And in the last 10 years, they've seen their enrollment drop by half. They really they haven't been able to really recover their enrollment, I think, as they had hoped since Hurricane Katrina. And at the same time, as that started to dwindle, the faculty and the staff numbers haven't always been adjusted to kind of accommodate that. They've got a larger campus now than what they have enrolled, and I think they're starting to try to bring that a little more in line.
And Southeastern has become stronger at recruiting people, and so if the kids in New Orleans and wants to leave town for college but can't go too far southeast, plus the Mississippi universities are becoming more aggressive and going after Louisiana students.
And so is the two-year programs, too. The community college system is definitely strengthening in Louisiana, and we see that Delgado's had tremendous growth. Baton Rouge Community College, I would guess that's probably impacting some enrollment over at UNO as well.
That's what they're saying, too, yes. The enrollment requirements have gotten stricter at UNO in the last few years as well, and that's taken almost 1,000 students that otherwise would have gone in the past right off the table.
So when you say they're going to be restructuring the university, what does that mean exactly? How are they going to restructure it?
Well, what they're going to do now is they're going to take this committee of about 24 deans and faculty, and they're going to try to set a criteria for evaluating the programs that they have. And some of the obvious things that they'll look at will be degree completions and how many students are even enrolling to start with. And from there, once they devise this criteria, they're going to make their recommendations to President Foss, who in the fall is going to make his recommendations to the UL Board of Advisors. And the way they're looking at it now is that by next spring, they're going to start to inform faculty and students which programs may be cut, and from there start to roll out how that'll go. Part of the requirement is that they'll have to teach out the students that are currently enrolled in those programs, so it could still be another 2 years before they start to realize the savings.
It's going to be a painful transition, but I was talking to one administrative level person in one department, and he's someone who believes that his department will survive. And he's upbeat about this because he saw this as really getting rid of the deadwood that's really draining on the rest of the university. And so if step two then means that some of that money can be poured back into his department and other departments, then he was more optimistic about the future.
Right, and President Foss, since he took over, has laid off, or has been forced to reduce the staff by almost, I think, about 110 people, including 28 just earlier this year. So for a while now, they've been taking from a reserve fund, but at this point, the pot is about empty.
So this move is to strengthen the university. When we hear about moves like this, of course, we worry about the ultimate fate of the university. The university is still going to be in place, but restructured is basically how you see it.
Right. I mean, they haven't really set a target, or at least publicly acknowledged how many of the 84-degree programs could end up on the chopping block as a result, but ultimately it'll be a smaller UNO when they're finished.
Do you think they would actually shrink the campus in some respect? Would they repurpose some of those buildings, for instance?
It's certainly possible. I mean, it seems as though they've got more buildings now than they
Yes.
need, and once they continue to shrink, they're going to have to figure something else out, because just the maintenance to have the buildings.
Well, I think the main campus will always be, but there was always big ambitions for the eastern campus, out where the arena is, and obviously they'll need that space, all that space now.
All right, thanks a lot, Richard. And Kathy, over to you. And sort of still speaking about college, engineering degree right now is really a pretty good one to have. UNO, by the way, does have an engineering program, but Tulane had stopped its engineering program after the storm. But if you have an engineering degree, you can have a good chance of getting a job.
You have a very good chance of getting a job around here these days at some good salaries, too. There's so much going on in the industrial sector throughout South Louisiana, and there's certainly the engineering firms here in New Orleans are certainly feeling it and feeling the demand. This also extends, of course, to architects in many respects as well, welders, and skilled tradesmen of all kinds. But the engineering personnel are really feeling it. LSU is the biggest generator of engineering talent in the state. I mean, that's your big engineering school. And they're in the process, they're about to kick off a $100 million upgrade of their engineering complex. This fall, they'll be breaking ground on a new facility, and they're going to expand it dramatically by 80,000 square feet. They are adding 50 faculty members, and they're about halfway. By the end of this year, they'll be about halfway to that number. By 2017, when the new complex opens, they should have at least 50 additional faculty from where they were last year, for instance. So this is a kind of across the board in the types of engineers. Structural engineers, civil engineers, petroleum engineers, of course, are continuing to be in demand as they have been for a long time across Louisiana. But the huge expansion going on in the petrochemical corridor all across South Louisiana and the lower Mississippi River, as we've talked about before, there are billions and billions of dollars going into expansions and new construction, and that means engineering jobs all over the place. We're also seeing here in New Orleans a very strong demand for marine engineering because there's so much marine construction going on. This is stemming from upgrades of fleets by companies like Tidewater, Hornbeck, Harvey Gulf Marine, and some others, Edison Schwest down in Galliano. And all of those are expanding their fleets, and that creates a demand for construction and engineering. In addition, we've seen, this is kind of interesting to me, that we've seen some out-of-state engineering firms reaching into this market. There's just so much demand now. And we've seen in the past year 2 firms from Seattle putting offices in New Orleans, which just seems, you'd think Puget Sound would have enough to do.
Right.
But, and also from Virginia. So we've seen some of these firms coming in and setting up shop in New Orleans to take a piece of this action.
So we see that business and industry needs the engineers, but are we seeing that we're getting the engineers of the future interested in actually becoming engineers? The students are there?
Well, that's interesting that you should say that, because I know I talked to people at UNO where they, as you mentioned, they do have and I don't know what's going to happen now with the engineering program in light of what, the new, the restructuring. But one of the things that they said is their effort is on getting high schoolers interested in becoming engineers and getting people to go into the program. LSU says the same thing, and they have been really recruiting hard in the high schools. And enrollment at LSU has gone up by 40% just in the last several years
in the engineering
department.
Do you recall, it's been a few years now, but do you recall why Tulane gave up its engineering?
Well, I wouldn't want to try to answer that question. You probably remember how controversial it was right after Katrina that they shut down that program, and everybody said, of all things to shut down at this point. So I don't have an answer to that, Errol, but everyone was puzzled certainly about it. But I think LSU is really, they've also said that their recruiting fairs, their corporate recruiting fairs, where they bring companies on campus to look at the students, there's been a vast increase in the number of companies participating in that as well. So
very interesting. I know there's certainly a certain member of my family who's going to be very, very happy. My cousin just had her son graduate from UNO Engineering School, so congrats to them both. Yeah, Mom, your son is going to get a good job, probably with a good degree. That's always good to hear. Okay, over to Stephanie now. Yeah. Common Core.
Here we are.
Again, yes, we're talking about Common Core. The governor now says, he said this week, he wants us out of it. This, of course, after a couple of years ago when he said he really wanted us in it. So where do we stand now with it?
It's been this very kind of slow motion backtrack for Bobby Jindal over the course of about a year, really, when he started getting questions at very conservative political events, and he, could read the mood of the room and say, well, and of course I'm against a national curriculum. And you think, well, you probably thought that was enough, because Common Core is not a national curriculum,
no, it's not.
Although there are people who think it is and are very upset about that. So he is looking at his ambition, at prospects outside the state. It's become a big issue among Republican voters, certainly very conservative Republican voters. A lot of other politicians who are possibly looking at running for president are denouncing it. Ted Cruz says, we have Common Core, it's called the Constitution. It's a big line for him. Marco Rubio, a lot of them. Rick Perry was never in it. But most states were, and it used to be something that was really, there was a bipartisan consensus. It was started not by the federal government, although President Obama supports it, and there is some federal funding behind it, so that gets to the whole federal takeover thing. But it was really started by a Republican governor from Georgia and a Democratic governor from Delaware, and 40-something states, I think 45 plus DC, originally signed on. And then once once the Tea Party revolution happened, once some of those governors left office and were replaced by maybe more ideological governors, Jindal used to have safety in numbers among Republican governors. He doesn't anymore. And I think that's one of the things that happened. So the legislature actually declined to pull out this year. That's something different than what's happened in some other states. A few states have now pulled out, but the legislatures and governors have agreed. Here, the legislature held fast, and Jindal now, after the session, is looking to cancel contracts. He's looking for kind of procedural ways to pull out, to the tremendous anger of John White, the state superintendent who he recruited, who has always been his ally in education reform. Also, the Board of Elementary Secondary Education, he appointed some of them, he supported their campaigns. It's a real war of words at this point, and it's unclear whether legally he can do it.
So as you say, John White and also the president of the Bessie Board, Chaz Romer, are very, very strong supporters of Common Core.
Yes.
So where does it stand there? I mean, can the governor go in? He can't remove John White, can he?
Oh, no. John White, and he said he doesn't want to. John White answers to Bessie. What he wants to do is basically cancel the contract with one of the testing consortiums and say Louisiana should develop its own test. And then he actually wants to go back to the legislature and say, and let's pull out. It would cost a lot of money. It's unclear how Louisiana standards would be different from federal standards. Of course, Bobby Jindal says, I'm for standards, I'm for testing. I just want them to be Louisiana standards. It seems like we did a story at The Advocate the other day. We spoke to a lot of school systems to try to figure out what are you going to do now that things are unclear. And they basically say, we're going ahead as planned. I mean, we've instituted this, we've trained for it, we're doing it.
Because it's been in place. It was in 2010 when?
Yes. So
curriculum has been devised to align with these Common Core standards.
It's been a little bit of a difficult rollout. There are a lot of bumps to smooth out, but that takes time and that can happen.
Why, if he's really sincere in his opposition, why did he wait until after the legislative session, and why not take it on during the legislative session and get laws passed?
It's very curious. He did not testify, for example. He was out of state at one of these political events on the day that the legislature heard it. I think it's, I almost think he keeps looking for something, this is my political take on it, that will take some of the pressure off, and it's not happening. So this seems to be something he decided after the legislative session.
So bottom line, though, what people out there are really worried about is what are their children going to face in school? So most of the schools are going to be following the curriculum designed
certainly
to match the Common Core standards.
Yes.
And the State Department of Education, don't they have sort of a helpline to help parents? I think if you go to that site or even to the Bessie Board site, there is some assistance for parents.
There really has been an effort to, maybe a little bit after the fact, because it has been difficult for a lot of kids and teachers and parents
to make this adjustment.
To make the adjustment, to explain what it is, to offer some help.
Okay, thanks a lot,
But
Stephanie.
it's a big program. Anytime you roll out a really big program, there are bound to be problems.
And we'll probably hear it about again in the next legislative session. Okay, we're going to go over to Errol, and it was 75 years ago that Pontchartrain Beach first opened its doors. We all have fond memories of Pontchartrain Beach.
Yeah, not from 75 years ago,
not
thankfully.
Quite,
okay.
Close, but not quite.
But speaking of UNO, if you're at UNO right now, the area across from the main campus on Lakeshore Drive, where the research park is, was the site of Pontchartrain Beach. And I remember in '83 when it was closing down, there was a lot of speculation about big-time developers coming in and condos and high-rises, and all of that never really happened. And you thought it would have been a really prime piece of property. And so now in the research park, I guess that's a good use for it, but it's a very quiet and a very passive use. But for 75 years, it was a thriving amusement park, and it started, of course, in the day before things like Disney World and Six Flags, before the theme parks. It was what was called an iron park, and by iron they meant you had all these rides that were made out of iron, and people would go round and round, and it had a big midway, and it was a big activity. It was, as far as those parks did, it was a good park. It was operated by the Bat family. Into the 1960s, segregation was an issue, as it was throughout all of New Orleans society, and so it was a segregated facility. And there was a separate beach for the black community called Lincoln Beach. And after the Civil Rights Bill, once the beach became integrated, which was a big moment. There was a lot of concern how that would work out. Lincoln Beach didn't last long after that, and so it's been its last years as an integrated facility. It used to have this big stage with acts on it, and like people like Elvis Presley would come by and sing, and
The Four Seasons,
and
I
Hank
remember
Williams,
seeing
yeah.
that.
And so it was popular. But I was thinking about it that it closed in '83, and part of the reason, well, first of all, its time was past, and those kind of things, especially with theme parks and people's. So easily. I mean, it couldn't compete with Disney World by any means. And so its time had passed, but also the World's Fair was going to open in New Orleans next year. But, since then, there's still not a big attraction along the lakefront, which has always been something that's annoyed me. I mean, I think our lakefront has a huge potential to do more and to still maintain green space and quiet space. And so there's still not this big public gathering place that the beach used to be.
Used to provide for us, yes, and like I said, some fond memories of Pontchartrain Beach. I guess right now we're just going to have to enjoy the water itself, just sitting on the seawall and enjoying.
And fewer people doing that. I should mention they had a restaurant called the Bally High. After the movie South Pacific came out, there were these kind of restaurants were starting all over. But the Bat family gave us two grandsons who are fairly prominent in New Orleans. Jay Batts, who was a former councilman, and Brian Batt, who's an actor. So
Thanks, Errol. Okay, looking ahead. Time to move on.
Well, a few weeks ago, we mentioned the possibility about British Airlines establishing a nonstop service between New Orleans and London later this year. Unfortunately, that's been pushed back, possibly to 2016. British Airlines needs to wait until they have the chance to get some more aircraft, so it's not happening as soon as we hoped.
Okay. Richard.
Well, last week, Kurt Mix, a former BP engineer, the first person tried in connection with the oil spill, was granted a new trial here in New Orleans after a federal judge cited jury misconduct. And I think in the coming days, maybe even next week, federal prosecutors are going to decide whether or not to appeal that or go forward with it.
Okay. Kathy?
Back to Common Core, I think you're going to hear more about the business opposition to Jindal's actions with Common Core. This is a situation where normally the organized business would be a backer of the Republican governor, but in this case they're very much devoted to the idea of Common Core, and they're very upset about what's happened with Governor Jindal.
Okay. Stephanie?
Back to federal court. Next week, there's a big hearing in federal court in Judge Feldman's chamber. The Louisiana gay marriage statute is being challenged. This, of course, has happened all over the country, and not one federal judge has upheld bans on gay marriage. This is a Reagan-appointed judge. It's going to be really interesting to see what he does. And it could go to the Fifth Circuit. There's a Texas case that's also pending before the Fifth Circuit. Okay. So he could defer to that, or he could roll.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Stephanie.
Yes.
Thanks so much for being here, you guys, this evening. And thank you guys for joining us. We hope to see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.